It was a breezy Saturday morning at the bustling flea market, where colorful tarps stretched over makeshift stalls, shielding endless assortments of trinkets, antiques, and second-hand treasures from the soft sunlight. The air buzzed with a symphony of chatter, haggling, and the occasional metallic clang of goods being shuffled around. The smell of roasted peanuts and freshly brewed coffee mingled with the earthy scent of aged wood and worn leather. Officer Marcus Blake moved through the lively scene with purpose. Tall, broad-shouldered, and ever alert, he wore the kind of expression that said he was always working, even if it was just a routine patrol. His neatly pressed uniform was a stark contrast to the chaos of the market. He wasn't there for the bargains or the charm. Marcus was there to keep the peace and spot trouble before it happened. His eyes scanned the crowd, landing on busy stall owners calling out prices and families marveling at dusty curiosities. He saw kids tugging at their parents' sleeves, beggars lurking in shadows, and eager collectors digging through piles of books and records. But then he saw her. She was unlike anyone else in the market that day. A petite woman, probably in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair tucked neatly under a floppy, wide-brimmed hat that looked as though it had been hastily grabbed on her way out. She wore a long, oversized coat patched together with an array of mismatched fabrics, reds, blues, yellows, all stitched unevenly, as if the coat had lived several lives before finding its way to her. Her leather bag hung loosely from her shoulder, weathered and cracked from years of use, its brass buckle barely holding on. Her mismatched shoes, one a scuffed brown boot and the other a tattered black sneaker, shuffled along the dirt path with an unhurried gait. The woman moved stall to stall, stopping frequently to pick up items, hold them up to the light, and then set them down without a word. Marcus tilted his head, narrowing his eyes. Suspicious, he muttered under his breath, shifting his weight slightly as he watched her. It wasn't just her peculiar appearance. There was something about her presence that didn't sit right with him. She didn't blend in with the eager bargain hunters, nor did she seem like one of the regular vendors. Most people at the flea market either carried an air of excitement or the weariness of hard labor, but she carried something else entirely. She moved as if she were searching for something specific, her gaze darting around the stalls like a hawk. Marcus adjusted his patrol route, steering himself closer to where she stood. As he approached, she picked up a porcelain figurine from a vendor's table and turned it over carefully, inspecting it like an appraiser at an auction. The vendor, a gruff man in a faded denim apron, watched her nervously, as if expecting her to drop the delicate piece. "See something you like?" the vendor asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. The woman didn't answer immediately. She set the figurine down with gentle precision, then moved on to the next stall without a word. Marcus folded his arms, observing her quietly. She wasn't in a hurry, but there was an intensity to her movements, a kind of deliberate focus that put him on edge. "Excuse me," he finally said, stepping forward to intercept her path. The woman looked up, her eyes meeting his with a calm, measured gaze. They were striking gray with flecks of blue, sharp and observant, like someone who had seen too much of the world. "Yes, officer," she said in a soft, steady voice. Marcus cleared his throat, slightly taken aback by her composure. "Just making my rounds," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Are you looking for something in particular?" She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that could mean anything. "I suppose you could say that," she replied. Her answer wasn't much of an answer, and Marcus felt his curiosity deepen. He didn't want to make a scene without cause, but his instincts told him to keep an eye on her. Something about her screamed out of place, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. As she walked away, Marcus decided to follow at a safe distance, weaving through the crowd as she meandered through the market. She stopped at a stall selling vintage fabrics, her fingers brushing over the colorful patterns with a tenderness that struck him as odd. She moved onto a table covered in old books, flipping through pages as if she were searching for a hidden clue. Who is she? Marcus wondered, his mind racing. She didn't seem dangerous, but there was an undeniable air of mystery about her. The woman eventually stopped at a quiet corner of the market, where an older vendor sat on a stool, surrounded by racks of clothing and boxes of old shoes. She leaned in close, speaking to the vendor in hushed tones that Marcus couldn't quite hear. He inched closer, pretending to inspect a nearby stall, straining to catch snippets of their conversation. "Been years since I've seen one like this," the vendor said, holding up what looked like a faded scarf. "Do you have anything else?" the woman asked, her voice laced with urgency. The vendor shook his head. "Not here. But there's a place." Before Marcus could hear more, the woman straightened up and handed the vendor a few bills, tucking something small into her bag. She glanced over her shoulder, and for a brief moment, her eyes locked with Marcus's. He froze. Had she noticed him following her? Her expression didn't give anything away. She turned and walked briskly toward the market's exit, leaving Marcus standing in the middle of the bustling crowd, his mind buzzing with questions. Who was this woman? What was she looking for? And why did it feel like she was hiding something far more significant than an odd coat and mismatched shoes? Little did Marcus know, his casual observation would unravel a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the woman, the market, and even himself. The flea market carried on around him, vibrant and noisy, but Officer Marcus Blake was laser-focused on the mysterious woman. She disappeared briefly behind a canopy of hanging wind chimes, their metallic melodies masking her footsteps. Marcus quickened his pace, weaving through a crowd that seemed oblivious to his pursuit. His gut told him there was more to her than met the eye. Years on the force had taught him to trust that feeling. People didn't wander flea markets with that level of purpose unless they were up to something or running from something. The woman turned sharply down a row of less crowded stalls, the kind where vendors sold oddities that didn't quite fit anywhere else. Marcus followed, his polished boots crunching on the dirt path. He could see her now, lingering at a table cluttered with old watches, rusted keys, and antique jewelry. Her fingers hovered over a delicate necklace with a broken clasp, its gemstones dull but unmistakably precious. "Lovely piece, isn't it?" the vendor said, a wiry man with glasses perched low on his nose. He reached out to pick up the necklace, but the woman's hand shot out first, gripping it tightly. "It is," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. She inspected it closely, turning it over as if searching for something hidden. Marcus noted how her hand trembled ever so slightly. "How much?" she asked, still holding the necklace. "For you?" 30, the vendor said, rubbing his hands together. She hesitated, then rummaged through her bag, pulling out a few crumpled bills. Marcus couldn't help but notice the way she glanced around as she handed the money over, her movements swift and cautious. The transaction complete, she tucked the necklace into her bag and turned to leave, but Marcus stepped into her path. "Ma'am," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Do you mind answering a few questions?" Her gaze flickered to his badge, then back to his face. She didn't look surprised to see him standing there, as if she'd been expecting this moment all along. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but guarded. "That depends," Marcus replied, crossing his arms. "You seem familiar. Have we met before?" The corner of her mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly. "I don't think so," she said. "I'm just passing through." "Passing through where?" Marcus pressed. She tilted her head, studying him with those sharp, piercing eyes. "Does it matter?" Marcus frowned. It wasn't the answer he was expecting, and the way she said it so calm, so deliberate unnerved him. He decided to switch tactics. "What's in the bag?" he asked. Her grip on the worn leather strap tightened ever so slightly. "Just a few things I picked up," she said. "Mind if I take a look?" Marcus asked, his tone still neutral but leaving little room for refusal. For the first time, She hesitated. Her lips parted as if to protest, but then she sighed and loosened her hold on the bag. She set it on a nearby table and opened it slowly, revealing its contents. Inside were the odds and ends of a typical flea market shopper, a small bundle of vintage fabrics, an old book with a cracked spine, and the necklace she'd just purchased. But Marcus's eyes were drawn to something tucked beneath the fabrics, a sketchbook with a weathered leather cover. "What's this?" he asked, reaching for it. The woman's hand darted out, grabbing the sketchbook before he could touch it. "Personal," she said sharply, her calm demeanor momentarily slipping. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You seem awfully protective of it." She took a deep breath, her expression softening. "It's sentimental," she said, her voice quiet again. Marcus studied her for a moment, weighing his next move. She wasn't acting like someone trying to hide stolen goods or contraband. Whatever was in that sketchbook, it clearly meant a great deal to her. "All right," he said finally, stepping back. "But I'll be keeping an eye on you." "Of course," she said with a faint smile, her composure fully restored. She closed the bag and slung it over her shoulder, walking away without another word. Marcus watched her go, his curiosity only deepening. The woman's measured strides took her toward the far edge of the market, where the stalls thinned out and the crowd grew sparse. Marcus followed at a distance, his mind racing. Who was she, really? And why did he feel like he'd seen her somewhere before? As she moved further from the main thoroughfare, Marcus noticed how the vendors seemed to treat her differently. While most shoppers were met with eager pitches and enthusiastic chatter, the vendors she approached fell silent, their expressions cautious, even reverent. At one stall, an elderly woman selling hand-woven scarves greeted her with a warm but knowing smile. "It's been a long time," the vendor said softly. The silver-haired woman nodded, her eyes glistening. "Too long," she replied. They exchanged a few quiet words, and then the vendor handed her a small, intricately embroidered scarf. The woman accepted it with a trembling hand, tucking it carefully into her bag. Marcus frowned. This wasn't normal flea market behavior. Whatever was happening here, it was far more than a simple shopping trip. He decided to approach the vendor once the woman moved on. "Excuse me," he said, flashing his badge. "What's your connection to that woman?" The elderly vendor's smile faded. "I don't know what you mean, officer," she said, her tone guarded. "You seemed pretty familiar with her," Marcus pressed. The vendor hesitated, glancing in the direction the woman had gone. "She's just an old customer," she said finally. "An old customer?" Marcus repeated, skeptical. "She doesn't strike me as a regular shopper." The vendor's lips tightened. "Sometimes, officer, it's best to leave people be." Marcus opened his mouth to reply, but the vendor had already turned away, busying herself with her wares. Frustrated but undeterred, Marcus set off again, following the woman's trail. He found her at the very edge of the market, standing before a sprawling display of vintage clothing. She was speaking to the vendor in hushed tones, her hands gesturing animatedly. As Marcus approached, the vendor, a middle-aged man with a thick beard and a weathered face, reached under the table and pulled out a garment bag. The woman unzipped it carefully, her eyes lighting up as she revealed a long, flowing gown inside. The fabric shimmered in the sunlight, its intricate beadwork catching every ray. Marcus stopped in his tracks, stunned. The gown was breathtaking, like something out of an old Hollywood film. It seemed almost too exquisite to belong in a place like this. "What's going on here?" Marcus demanded, stepping forward. Both the woman and the vendor looked up, startled. The woman quickly zipped up the garment bag and clutched it to her chest. "Just a purchase," she said calmly. "A purchase?" Marcus repeated, his voice laced with suspicion. "That dress doesn't exactly scream flea market find." The vendor stepped forward, his expression defiant. She paid for it fair and square, he said. What's it to you? Marcus ignored him, focusing on the woman. Care to explain why someone like you is walking around with a gown like that? The woman's lips curved into a faint smile. Someone like me, she echoed. Marcus felt his face flush. You know what I mean, he said. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Maybe you should stop assuming, officer, she said softly. Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with more questions than answers. As Marcus trailed behind her, his eyes stayed fixed on her every move. The flea market bustled around them, filled with laughter, chatter, and the occasional sound of clinking coins, yet his focus was unshakable. She walked with an odd confidence, stopping at stalls with a purpose that felt out of place for a casual browser. The vendors noticed her too, their eyes lingering just a bit longer than usual. Whispers followed in her wake, barely audible over the hum of the crowd. That's her, one vendor muttered, leaning toward a neighboring stall. Always snooping around, acting like she owns the place. Yeah, another replied under his breath. Never buys much, but she knows too much about everything we sell. Gives me the creeps. Marcus's frown deepened. He wasn't sure what to make of their words, but one thing was clear: this woman wasn't just an ordinary shopper. Was she a thief? A scam artist? Or was there something else entirely going on here? He quickened his pace as she stopped at a jewelry stall, her hands reaching for a tray of vintage brooches. The vendor, an older man with weathered hands and a skeptical glare, stiffened as her fingers hovered over the display. She picked up a brooch, turning it over slowly as if she were searching for a hidden detail. Excuse me, ma'am, Marcus said, stepping forward. His tone was authoritative but not aggressive. The woman turned to face him, her expression calm and poised, as if she'd expected this confrontation. Yes, officer, she replied, her voice steady and soft, yet there was an unmistakable sharpness in her tone, a quiet confidence that made Marcus hesitate for a split second. I've had some reports about suspicious activity around here, he said, keeping his gaze locked on hers. Mind if I ask what you're up to? A faint smile tugged at her lips, one that seemed to hold more secrets than answers. She held up the brooch, its delicate design catching the light. Suspicious activity, she echoed, her tone carrying a hint of amusement. I'm just appreciating the craftsmanship. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Appreciating, huh? With intent to buy. She chuckled softly, the sound barely audible over the market's din. Not today, she said, setting the brooch back on the tray with care. But I know its value. Her words lingered in the air, and Marcus couldn't ignore the weight they carried. There was something about the way she spoke, confident, measured, as if she were used to being underestimated but never truly ignored. Knowing its value doesn't mean it's yours, Marcus said, his tone sharpening. She turned to him fully now, her silver-streaked hair catching the light under her wide-brimmed hat. Her eyes, gray with flecks of blue, studied him carefully, like she was reading more than just his uniform. You're right, she said simply. But value is more than a price tag. This piece, she gestured to the brooch, a delicate arrangement of pearls and gilded leaves, was likely crafted in the 1940s. Look at the hinge, see how it's a T-bar clasp? That design went out of style decades ago. And the pearls? They're not imitation. This belonged to someone who cared about the finer things. Marcus stared at her, caught off guard by the precision of her observation. Even the vendor looked surprised, his skepticism giving way to a grudging respect. You know a lot about old jewelry, Marcus said, narrowing his eyes. I know a lot about many things, she replied evenly. And it's not a crime, is it? Her calm defiance unsettled him. Marcus wasn't used to feeling outmaneuvered, but this woman had an air of mystery that made it difficult to pin her down. She wasn't doing anything illegal, at least not yet, but there was something about her that didn't sit right. "Why don't you tell me your name?" he asked, crossing his arms. She hesitated for the first time, her gaze flickering away for a brief moment. "Eleanor," she said finally. "Eleanor what?" "Just Eleanor," she replied, her faint smile returning. Marcus exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. "All right, Eleanor. Do you come here often?" She tilted her head slightly, as if amused by the question. "Often enough," she said. "Why?" Her eyes sparkled with something unreadable, mischief, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. "Because every piece here has a story," she said, gesturing to the market around them. "And some stories are worth finding." Marcus didn't know how to respond to that. Before he could press further, she turned away, walking toward the next stall as if their conversation had been nothing more than a minor detour. Marcus decided to keep his distance, his instincts telling him there was more to Eleanor than her cryptic words and peculiar demeanor. She moved through the market with the same deliberateness as before, pausing at certain stalls and engaging with vendors in quiet conversations that he couldn't quite hear. At one stall, she examined an old pocket watch, her fingers tracing the intricate engravings on its surface. The vendor, a younger man with a scruffy beard, watched her nervously. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, holding up the watch. The vendor shrugged. "Just an antique, I guess. $10 if you want it." Eleanor shook her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. "It's not just an antique. This is a railroad watch from the early 1900s. See the markings here? They were used to keep trains running on time. Precision was everything." The vendor blinked, clearly caught off guard. Yeah. Sure. 15, then." Eleanor laughed softly and set the watch back on the table. "Not today," she said, her tone teasing. Marcus watched the exchange with growing curiosity. She wasn't stealing or causing trouble, but there was an undeniable tension in the way the vendors interacted with her. They seemed wary, almost as if they respected her knowledge but feared what she might uncover. He followed her to yet another stall, this one selling stacks of old photographs and postcards. Eleanor sifted through them with care, her movements deliberate as she pulled out a faded photograph of a woman in an elegant gown. She studied it closely, her expression unreadable. "What's the story here?" she asked the vendor, an elderly man with a kind face. "Ah, that one," he said, leaning forward. "Came from an estate sale. The woman in the photo was a singer, I think. Had a voice like an angel, or so they said." Eleanor nodded slowly, her fingers brushing over the photograph. "She looks familiar," she murmured, almost to herself. Marcus couldn't take it anymore. He stepped closer, his presence unmistakable now. "What exactly are you looking for, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice firm. She looked up at him, her expression calm but guarded. "Does it matter?" she asked. "It does if you're hiding something," Marcus said. Her faint smile returned, but there was no warmth in it this time. "I'm not hiding anything, officer," she said. "But some stories aren't ready to be told." Marcus opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, Eleanor tucked the photograph into her bag, handed the vendor a few bills, and walked away. As Eleanor disappeared into the crowd, Marcus clenched his jaw and followed, his curiosity morphing into something sharper. She wasn't breaking any laws yet, but there was an undeniable air of mystery about her. She had knowledge that seemed too specific, too personal, and the way vendors alternated between deference and suspicion only fueled his resolve to get answers. She moved to another stall, this one showcasing stacks of vintage clothing. A vibrant silk scarf caught her eye, and she lifted it with careful hands, running her fingers over the delicate embroidery. "This," she murmured, almost to herself, "is hand-stitched. Italian, mid-20th century. Probably custom made. The vendor, a middle-aged woman with a skeptical glance, folded her arms. It's just an old scarf. $10. Eleanor's smile widened. If you knew its history, you'd ask for much more. The vendor narrowed her eyes. Lady, are you trying to up my prices or what? Eleanor chuckled softly and set the scarf back down. Just appreciating craftsmanship, she said, her voice calm but with an edge that suggested she knew far more than she let on. Marcus stepped closer, clearing his throat loudly enough to make both women turn. Eleanor, he said firmly, we need to talk. Now. Her smile faltered for the first time, replaced by a look of mild irritation. Talk about what, officer? You're making everyone here nervous, Marcus said, gesturing to the vendors who were now openly staring at her. They think you're up to something. Eleanor sighed and adjusted her hat, her movements unhurried. And what do you think, officer? Am I a danger to public safety? A master criminal? I think you're hiding something, Marcus replied, his voice steady. Her eyes met his, sharp and unyielding. Everyone hides something, Officer Blake. Even you. The mention of his name made him freeze. He hadn't introduced himself, and his badge wasn't visible. How do you know my name? He demanded, his voice lowering to a near growl. Eleanor tilted her head, her expression almost playful. It's on your belt clip, she said, gesturing subtly to the nameplate tucked near his hip. Marcus glanced down and exhaled slowly, forcing himself to calm down. She wasn't wrong, but her ability to notice such small details unnerved him. You're avoiding the question, he said. And you're avoiding the answer, she countered, her voice soft but firm. Before he could respond, Eleanor turned and walked away again, her pace steady but purposeful. Marcus cursed under his breath and followed, weaving through the crowded market as she navigated her way to the far end. Eleanor finally stopped at a quiet corner of the market, where a small table was set up with old photographs and faded documents. She sifted through the items with care, her expression growing more intense as she examined each piece. Marcus kept his distance this time, watching her closely. She seemed different now. The playful, almost taunting edge in her demeanor had faded, replaced by something heavier. She pulled out an old photograph from the pile, holding it up to the light. Marcus couldn't see it clearly, but he caught a glimpse of a woman in a long gown, standing on a grand staircase. This is hers, Eleanor murmured, her voice barely audible. The vendor, a wiry man with glasses perched on the tip of his nose, looked up. You know her? Eleanor nodded slowly. I knew of her. Marcus stepped forward, his curiosity overwhelming his instinct to hold back. Who is she? He asked. Eleanor glanced at him, her expression unreadable. A woman who knew the value of things, she said cryptically. But not in the way you'd think. Marcus folded his arms. Enough riddles, Eleanor. Who are you, and what are you really doing here? She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to tell him the truth. Finally, she sighed and reached into her bag, pulling out a small, leather-bound notebook. She handed it to him without a word. Marcus opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the neatly written entries inside. Each page was filled with notes, detailed descriptions of artifacts, their origins, and, in some cases, the names of their former owners. This is, he started, but his words trailed off as he realized the depth of what he was holding. It's a record, Eleanor said quietly. A record of stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Marcus frowned. Why do you have this? Because someone has to, she replied simply. Eleanor gestured to the photograph still in her hand. This woman, she said, holding it up for Marcus to see, was a singer in the 1930s. She performed for sold-out audiences but lived a life of quiet struggle. This brooch I pointed out earlier. She smiled faintly. It belonged to her. It was a gift from her husband on their wedding day. Marcus stared at her, his skepticism softening into something closer to curiosity. How do you know all this? Eleanor tucked the photograph into her bag and looked him straight in the eye. Because I've spent my life finding the pieces of people's stories, she said. And sometimes, those pieces find me. Marcus was silent for a moment, trying to process what she was saying. So, what is this? Some kind of personal mission? Eleanor chuckled softly. You could call it that. Or you could call it what it really is, a way to make sure the past isn't forgotten. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Marcus didn't know whether to believe her or to keep pressing, but one thing was certain, Eleanor wasn't like anyone he'd ever met before. The flea market bustled with activity, but Marcus's attention stayed locked on Eleanor. She moved through the stalls like a seasoned hunter, her sharp eyes scanning for treasures hidden among the ordinary. Vendors reacted to her with a mixture of awe and unease, as though they couldn't decide whether she was a savior or a threat. At a stall selling an assortment of scarves, she paused, her fingers grazing over the vibrant fabrics before stopping at a faded one tucked at the bottom of the pile. She pulled it out carefully and unfolded it, revealing a delicate, intricate pattern. Do you know what you have here? She asked the vendor, a wiry man in his early 40s with a skeptical frown. He shrugged. Just an old scarf. $5 if you want it? Eleanor smiled knowingly, holding the scarf up to the light. This is a 1920s Hermes original. Look at the hand-rolled edges and the intricate print. These details are unmistakable. The vendor blinked, his skepticism giving way to shock. You're serious? She nodded, pulling out a crisp $100 bill from her bag. If you're willing to part with it, I'll pay you fairly. The man hesitated, glancing at the scarf as if seeing it for the first time. Then he took the bill with trembling hands. Deal, he said, his voice almost reverent. Marcus watched the exchange from a few steps away, his skepticism shaken. Who was this woman? And how could she identify something so specific and rare in a pile of forgotten textiles? Eleanor moved onto a stall cluttered with old books and documents. Her fingers schemed over the spines of the worn volumes until she stopped abruptly. She pulled out a book, its leather cover cracked with age, and opened it to reveal delicate illustrations of flowers. Ah, she murmured, almost to herself. A first edition of Flora Britannia. Mid-1800s. The binding's damaged, but the illustrations are intact. Remarkable. The vendor, a young woman with a distracted air, looked up from her phone. It's just an old book. $3. Eleanor chuckled softly, shaking her head. Do you know how rare this is? Books like this were often destroyed or repurposed for scrap paper. You're holding a piece of history. The vendor frowned. Should I be charging more, then? I'd suggest you research its value, Eleanor said, her tone kind but firm. This book could be worth a few $100s to the right collector. The young woman stared at Eleanor in disbelief, but the older woman was already placing the book back on the table, her interest seemingly satisfied. Marcus approached, his curiosity pushing him to engage. Why didn't you buy it? He asked, his voice low. Eleanor glanced at him, her expression calm. Because it's not my story to take, she said simply, her words cryptic but oddly profound. Word of Eleanor's presence seemed to spread. Vendors began watching her movements more closely, some leaning in to hear her insights as she examined their goods. At one stall, she picked up a tarnished silver bracelet, its design intricate but subtle. This isn't just silver, she said, holding it up for the vendor to see. It's niello work, an ancient technique. Likely 19th century Russian. See the detail in the etching. The vendor, a grizzled man with years of market experience, squinted at the bracelet. You sure about that? Eleanor nodded. I'd suggest cleaning it carefully. Restored, it could fetch a decent price at auction. The man muttered something under his breath, but it wasn't irritation. It sounded more like gratitude. Marcus, still observing, crossed his arms. You know a lot about antiques, he said, his voice tinged with suspicion. I know enough, Eleanor replied without looking at him. Enough for what? He pressed. She finally turned to face him, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. Enough to recognize the value of things most people overlook, she said. Including people. Eleanor's words lingered in Marcus's mind as she moved to another stall. This one was overflowing with small trinkets, keys, buttons, and coins piled haphazardly in boxes. She sifted through the collection until her hand paused over a dull, rusted coin. May I? She asked the vendor, a heavy-set woman with a no-nonsense attitude. Go ahead, the vendor replied, her tone indifferent. Eleanor picked up the coin and studied it closely, her thumb brushing away some of the dirt. This is a Roman denarius, she said, her voice tinged with wonder. Probably 2nd century. The vendor snorted. Lady, it's just a rusty old coin. Eleanor smiled faintly. To you, maybe. But to a historian, it's a glimpse into the past. The vendor frowned, her skepticism softening into curiosity. How much is it worth? Eleanor shook her head. Its worth depends on the story it tells. And on who's willing to listen. Marcus stepped forward, unable to stay silent any longer. Why do you keep doing this? He asked. Doing what? Eleanor asked, her tone light but challenging. Pointing out these treasures, giving advice to vendors you don't even know. What's in it for you? Eleanor met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Not everything is about profit, Officer Blake. Some things are about preserving what matters. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that Marcus couldn't ignore. The more Marcus watched Eleanor, the more he began to see a pattern in her actions. She wasn't just identifying valuable items, she was teaching the vendors to see the worth in what they had, to recognize the stories behind their goods. At one point, she stopped at a stall filled with faded photographs and postcards. She picked up a black and white photo of a young woman in a flapper dress, standing in front of an ornate theater. This is remarkable, Eleanor said softly. The vendor, an elderly man with kind eyes, leaned forward. Why's that? Eleanor pointed to the theater's marquee in the background. This was taken in front of the Tivoli Theater in 1928. The woman in the photo, she was likely a performer. See the stage door in the corner? She's standing near it, not in the main crowd. The vendor stared at the photo, his expression shifting from indifference to reverence. I had no idea, he said quietly. Eleanor nodded, handing the photo back to him. Now you do. Marcus found himself re-evaluating his assumptions about Eleanor. She wasn't a thief or a con artist. She was something else entirely, a protector of history, a storyteller who used objects to connect people to their past. But there was still something she wasn't telling him, and Marcus was determined to find out what it was. Eleanor, he said, stepping closer, you're not just here for the treasures, are you? She looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. What makes you say that? Because the way you talk about these things, it's personal, Marcus said. You're not just identifying antiques. You're searching for something. Eleanor's expression softened, but she didn't reply immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. She handed it to Marcus without a word. Inside, Marcus found page after page of meticulous notes, descriptions of objects, their origins, and the stories attached to them. It was a catalogue of forgotten histories, carefully preserved. What is this? He asked, his voice low. My life's work, Eleanor said simply. Marcus stared at her, realizing for the first time just how much depth lay behind her calm demeanor. She wasn't just a woman at a flea market. She was a keeper of stories, a bridge between the past and the present. And for the first time, Marcus began to wonder if her story was the most important one of all. The energy of the flea market seemed to shift around Eleanor. Vendors who had once been indifferent now leaned in when she approached, eager to hear what she might say. Some even started pulling items from behind their displays, asking her to take a look. Marcus, however, wasn't just watching anymore. He was invested. The notebook in his hand felt heavier than it should, as if it carried not just the weight of its pages but of lives and moments frozen in time. Eleanor moved to a stall piled high with ceramic figurines. Most were chipped, their paint fading, but her eyes focused on a small, unassuming figure of a woman holding a basket. "This one," she said, picking it up carefully. The vendor, a middle-aged man with calloused hands, chuckled. "That old thing? Can't even sell it for $1. Eleanor turned the figurine over, revealing a faint maker's mark on the bottom. "This is Meissen porcelain," she said. "Late 18th century, likely part of a set commissioned for a noble family." The man blinked, his expression shifting from amusement to disbelief. "You're kidding." Eleanor shook her head. "It's rare. With restoration, it could be worth thousands." Marcus watched as the vendor's face lit up, gratitude mixing with astonishment. But what struck him more was the way Eleanor handled the figurine, cradling it like it was something precious. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself walking beside Eleanor, the unspoken tension between them giving way to a tentative camaraderie. "You've got a gift," he admitted finally, breaking the silence. Eleanor smirked. "Not a gift. Just years of paying attention." "To what?" he asked. "To the things people forget," she replied, her tone soft. "Stories, craftsmanship, lives. Objects hold more than just value, they hold memories." Her words hung in the air, and Marcus found himself wanting to know more. But every time he tried to probe deeper, she deflected, steering the conversation back to the items around them. At a stall selling vintage luggage, she stopped again. Her fingers traced the initials embossed on a battered leather suitcase. C.E.H, she murmured. "What's that?" Marcus asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened the case, revealing a lining printed with faded travel stamps. "This belonged to someone who traveled extensively," she said. "Europe, Asia, Africa. Likely a diplomat or an explorer." Marcus frowned. "How can you possibly know that?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "The stamps, the wear on the handle, the construction of the case, it all tells a story if you know how to listen." For the first time, Marcus saw something crack in Eleanor's composed exterior. As she stared at the suitcase, her eyes softened, a flicker of something unspoken passing across her face. "Did you know them?" he asked gently. Eleanor hesitated, then shook her head. "No," she said, but the word felt hollow, as though it wasn't the whole truth. Marcus decided not to press, but his instincts told him there was more to her connection with these objects than she was letting on. They reached the far end of the market, where the stalls were fewer and the atmosphere quieter. Eleanor stopped at a table covered in old photographs, medals, and letters. She sifted through the items with a kind of reverence, her hands pausing over a small, framed portrait of a young man in uniform. "This," she said softly, "is remarkable." The vendor, an older woman with sharp eyes, leaned in. "Why's that?" Eleanor turned the frame over, revealing an inscription on the back, "To my dearest Margaret, until we meet again." 1943. This man was likely a soldier during World War II, Eleanor explained. The craftsmanship of the frame suggests it was a gift, something meaningful, something personal. The vendor's expression softened. "I didn't even notice that," she admitted. Eleanor smiled faintly. Most people don't. But it's the details that matter. As Marcus watched the exchange, he felt a strange sense of clarity. Eleanor wasn't just identifying objects, she was piecing together fragments of lives, connecting people to their history in a way that was both profound and deeply personal. Marcus couldn't hold back any longer. As Eleanor began to move on, he stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Eleanor," he said firmly, "I need to know the truth. Why are you really here?" She sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight of the day had finally caught up with her. "I told you, Officer Blake, I'm here for the stories." "That's not all, is it?" he pressed. For a long moment, she was silent. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out another item, an old, weathered photograph of a young woman standing in front of a grand estate. "This," she said, holding it up, "is my mother." Marcus blinked, taken aback. "Your mother?" Eleanor nodded. "She grew up in a world of elegance and beauty, surrounded by treasures most people could only dream of. But when the war came, everything was lost. This market, it's where some of those pieces ended up. I've spent years trying to find them." Her voice cracked slightly, and for the first time, Marcus saw the vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. As the sun began to set, the flea market started to quiet down. Eleanor and Marcus stood by a stall near the entrance, the weight of their conversation lingering between them. "You're not just looking for objects," Marcus said finally. "You're looking for pieces of your past." Eleanor nodded. "And in doing so, I help others find theirs. It's a way of honoring what was lost." Marcus stared at her, his respect for the woman deepening. "You're something else, Eleanor." She smiled faintly. "So are you, Officer Blake." Most people wouldn't have cared enough to ask. As the vendors began packing up their stalls, Marcus realized he wasn't ready to let the day end. "Let me help you," he said. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Help me how?" He gestured to the market around them. "By keeping an eye out. By asking questions. By making sure people like you have the space to do what you do." For the first time, Eleanor's smile reached her eyes. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Would you like me to continue weaving this into a crescendo where Marcus and Eleanor uncover a significant artifact tied to her past, or should the focus shift to a broader resolution of her mission and their newfound understanding? Let me know." Marcus stared at the business card in Clara's hand, his skepticism battling with the growing sense of awe. The simple black lettering stood out starkly against the cream card stock, "Clara Winthrop, fashion historian and consultant." Beneath it, the names of globally renowned institutions glared back at him: the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Met Gala Committee, Christie's Auction House. This can't be real," Marcus stammered. He was used to liars and grifters spinning elaborate tales, but Clara's calm demeanor and the details of her expertise were hard to deny. "It's very real," Clara said, her voice steady but not smug. She tucked the card back into her bag. "And while I'm flattered by your interest, Officer Blake, I prefer to keep a low profile." Marcus's mind reeled. All day, he had been shadowing her, convinced she was a criminal or at least a troublemaker. Yet here she was, not just an expert but a figure of significance in a world he barely understood. "Okay," Marcus said after a beat, "if that's true, then why the act? The coat, the shoes, everything." Clara smiled faintly. "In my line of work, blending in is essential. The moment people know who I am, the prices skyrocket. Sellers start hiding items, or worse, fakes suddenly appear. I've learned it's better to be underestimated." Marcus's eyebrows shot up. "So, this whole time, you've been undercover?" "Call it strategic anonymity," Clara replied. "It's not just about money, officer. It's about authenticity. These pieces, scarves, brooches, even that suitcase are threads in the fabric of history. If I don't act quickly, they'll vanish forever, sold to someone who won't understand their significance, or worse, discarded. Their conversation was interrupted by a vendor calling out, "Ms. Winthrop." Clara turned, her expression softening. The vendor, a woman in her 60s, held up a garment bag. "I think I might have something you'd like to see." Clara walked over, curiosity lighting up her face. Marcus followed closely, still trying to process everything he had learned. The vendor unzipped the bag to reveal a vintage, hand-embroidered coat in impeccable condition. Clara's breath hitched. This is a Worth original," she murmured, her fingers brushing the delicate embroidery. "Late 19th century, likely custom-made for a client." The vendor beamed. "I thought it looked special. Found it in an attic clean-out a few weeks ago." "Special?" Clara's voice was almost reverent. "This is priceless. It's a masterpiece of craftsmanship and history." Marcus watched as Clara carefully examined the coat. For the first time, he saw not just a shrewd expert, but someone genuinely moved by what she found. "Why does this matter so much to you?" Marcus asked, his tone softer now. Clara looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Because these pieces are more than objects. They're stories. They carry the lives of the people who made them, wore them, cherished them. When I find something like this, I'm not just holding fabric, I'm holding someone's legacy." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply. Marcus had spent his career chasing thieves, breaking up fights, and solving petty disputes. His job was about protecting people in the here and now. But Clara's mission was about protecting the past, ensuring that stories weren't lost to time. For a moment, Marcus felt the weight of her work. The patience, the knowledge, the passion, it all added up to something extraordinary. Just as Clara was about to purchase the coat, another voice cut through the air. "Wait. Let me see that." A man in a sharp suit emerged from the crowd. He had the look of someone important, or at least someone who thought he was. Marcus immediately went on alert. "And you are?" "Daniel Hargrove," the man said, flashing a business card that Marcus didn't bother to read. "I'm an appraiser for a private collector." Clara's jaw tightened. "What a coincidence," she said coolly. "You always seem to show up at the worst times." Hargrove smirked. "Come now, Clara. We both know the game. That coat is worth a fortune, and my client is prepared to pay top dollar." Marcus stepped between them, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. "This isn't an auction house. Back off." Hargrove sneered but didn't press further. He shot Clara a pointed look before disappearing into the crowd. "Who was that?" Marcus asked. "A rival," Clara said with a sigh. "He works for private collectors who don't care about history, only status. If he gets his hands on this coat, it'll vanish into some billionaire's closet, never to be seen again." Marcus looked at Clara, then at the coat. He thought about the vendors, the stories, and everything he had seen that day. "What do you need to do to stop him?" he asked. Clara hesitated, then said, "I'll buy it now, but I need to get it authenticated and documented before anyone can challenge my claim." Marcus nodded. "Then let's make it happen." Together, they moved swiftly, negotiating a fair price with the vendor. Marcus kept a wary eye on the crowd, ensuring that Hargrove or anyone else didn't try to interfere. Finally, the deal was done. The coat was carefully packed, and Clara looked at Marcus with genuine gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "I don't say this often, but I couldn't have done it without you." Marcus shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Just doing my job. Protecting treasures, right?" As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the flea market in a golden glow, Clara and Marcus stood by the edge of the lot. "So, what happens now?" Marcus asked. Clara glanced at the coat in her hands. Now, I make sure this piece finds its rightful place. A museum, perhaps, where everyone can appreciate its beauty and history. Marcus nodded. And you? Will you be back here next weekend, blending in with the crowd? Clara chuckled. Always. There's always more to discover. As she walked away, Marcus felt a newfound respect for the woman he had so misjudged. Clara Winthrop wasn't just a shopper or a collector. She was a guardian of history, a storyteller in her own right. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he had played a part in something truly meaningful. The following weekend, the flea market was abuzz with a different energy. The vendors, who once exchanged skeptical glances when Clara walked by, now greeted her with smiles and nods of recognition. Her presence, once a point of tension, had become a symbol of opportunity. Ms. Winthrop called out a man from a stall selling old furniture. I think I've got something special this time. Could you take a look? Clara stepped forward, her discerning eyes scanning the piece, a wooden chest with intricate carvings. She ran her fingers along its edges, testing the hinges and inspecting the craftsmanship. This is an original campaign chest from the early 1900s, she said, her tone both certain and kind. See these brass corners and the dovetail joints? It's a beautiful piece. The vendor's face lit up. I had no idea. What do you think it's worth? Clara chuckled. That depends on its condition and provenance, but with a little care, it could fetch a good price at auction. Marcus, standing nearby, marveled at how quickly Clara had become the market's unofficial expert. Vendors now saw her not as a threat but as a mentor who could turn their overlooked items into treasures. Meanwhile, Marcus had taken steps to ensure the market remained a haven for small vendors and treasure seekers. Inspired by Clara's knowledge and dedication, he proposed new security measures to protect the vendors from exploitation by opportunists like Daniel Hargrove. We're introducing vendor education sessions, Marcus explained to the market's coordinator. People like Clara can teach them how to spot valuable items and avoid getting cheated by dishonest buyers. The coordinator, a wiry man in his 70s named Mr. Green, nodded enthusiastically. That's exactly what we need. Clara's already done so much just by being here. Word of the initiative spread quickly. Clara agreed to host a workshop, teaching vendors the basics of identifying valuable textiles, jewelry, and antiques. As Clara settled into her new role as the market's trusted advisor, Marcus hadn't forgotten about Daniel Hargrove. A week after their confrontation, Marcus spotted him lingering near a stall, attempting to intimidate a young vendor into selling an antique clock for a fraction of its value. Back again, Hargrove, Marcus said, stepping between him and the vendor. Hargrove smirked, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Just doing business, officer. Nothing illegal about that. Not illegal, maybe, Marcus replied, his tone steely. But unethical? Definitely. Marcus escorted Hargrove to the edge of the market, making it clear he wasn't welcome. This market is for honest traders and people who respect its value. If I see you here again, we'll have a problem. The vendors watched with quiet satisfaction as Hargrove slunk away. Clara's workshop drew a large crowd. With her patched coat replaced by a sharp blazer, she stood at the center of a semicircle of eager faces, holding up a vintage handbag. This, she began, might look like just another old purse. But the stitching, the clasp, and the lining all tell a story. This is a genuine 1940s Chanel, a piece of history. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Clara passed the bag around, showing them the subtle details that made it valuable. Knowledge is power, she continued. The more you know, the less likely you are to be taken advantage of. Marcus stood at the back, arms crossed, a small smile playing on his lips. He had initially doubted Clara, but now, he admired her. She wasn't just helping the vendors earn a fair price, she was empowering them to see the worth in what they had. For Marcus, the experience had been transformative. He had spent years enforcing the law, seeing people through a lens of suspicion. But Clara had shown him the importance of looking deeper, of understanding the stories behind the surface. One evening, after the market had closed, Marcus approached Clara as she was packing up a newly acquired treasure, a delicate porcelain figurine. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About how everything has a story." Clara paused, her hands carefully wrapping the figurine in tissue paper. And maybe I've been missing a lot of them," Marcus admitted. "I spend so much time looking for trouble, I forget to see the good in people." Clara smiled warmly. "It's never too late to start seeing things differently, Officer Blake." Months passed, and the flea market transformed. Vendors began presenting their items with pride, sharing the stories behind each piece. Shoppers came not just to browse but to learn, hoping to stumble upon their own hidden treasures. Clara continued her work, her influence spreading far beyond the market. She published articles about the importance of preserving historical artifacts and gave lectures at local libraries and community centers. Marcus became a regular at her workshops, often lending a hand or offering security advice. The two developed an unlikely friendship, built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to protecting the value of the market. One day, as Clara prepared to leave the market, Marcus walked her to her car. "You've really changed this place," he said. "It's better because of you." Clara chuckled. "I think we both had a hand in that." As she drove away, Marcus stood in the fading light, the sounds of the bustling market fading into the distance. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing he had played a role in preserving something meaningful. Sometimes, he thought, justice wasn't about making arrests or solving crimes. Sometimes, it was about standing up for what mattered and helping others see the value in what they had all along. The flea market was winding down, but the energy lingered. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm golden hue over the stalls and reflecting off the vibrant trinkets still spread across tables. Clara, her patched coat catching the light like a quilt of memories, moved with her usual deliberate pace, her presence now celebrated rather than questioned. Marcus leaned against a lamp-post, arms crossed, a faint smile on his face. Watching her interact with the vendors was like seeing a symphony unfold. Each conversation held a rhythm, each smile a note, and together, they played a melody of connection and discovery. He had underestimated her, as so many had. Her mismatched shoes, her quiet demeanor, the way she slipped through the crowd without drawing attention, these weren't signs of weakness or irrelevance. They were her strength. Clara had mastered the art of seeing and being unseen, of finding value where others saw none. As Marcus reflected, he realized how much he'd learned from her, not just about the flea market but about life itself. People, like the objects scattered across the market's stalls, carried layers of history and meaning. Some were rough around the edges, their worth buried under years of neglect. Others gleamed in plain sight but were overlooked because of assumptions or biases. Clara had shown him that it wasn't enough to observe, one had to engage, to ask questions, to seek understanding. Before leaving, Clara paused by Marcus. She held a small package wrapped in brown paper, tied neatly with a piece of string. "For you," she said, handing it to him. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Just a little something I found. I think you'll appreciate it." He unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a vintage badge case, worn but still sturdy. The leather had a deep patina, and the metal clasp shone with a soft gleam. "It's from the 1930s, Clara explained. "A police officer once carried this, back when communities were smaller, and everyone knew each other's names. It reminded me of you." Marcus ran his fingers over the leather, speechless. "I think you're the kind of officer who sees beyond the badge," Clara said with a warm smile. And that's something rare. As Clara walked toward her car, Marcus clutched the badge case, feeling its weight not just in his hand but in his heart. Her words stayed with him, resonating deeply. The flea market, he realized, wasn't just a collection of goods for sale. It was a microcosm of the world, full of hidden stories, overlooked treasures, and the chance to connect with something meaningful. And Clara? She wasn't just a curator of fashion or antiques. She was a curator of human connection, of understanding, of finding worth in the mundane and the forgotten. In the weeks that followed, Marcus noticed a shift in himself. On patrol, he started engaging more with people, asking about their lives, their challenges, their joys. He found himself drawn to the stories behind the faces he encountered. The flea market, too, began to thrive in new ways. Clara's influence lingered, not just in the improved confidence of the vendors but in the way the community rallied together. Vendors helped each other identify valuable items, shoppers arrived eager to learn, and the market transformed into a place where history and humanity intertwined. Months later, Clara returned to the market for a brief visit. Marcus spotted her immediately, her patched coat unmistakable among the crowd. "Back for more treasures?" he asked, approaching her with a grin. Clara laughed softly. "Always. But the real treasures aren't the objects, Marcus. They're the people who bring them here, who carry their stories, who share a part of themselves with the world." Marcus nodded. "You've taught me that. And it's changed the way I see everything." Clara tilted her head, her expression warm. "Good. Because once you start seeing the world that way, you never stop." As Clara disappeared into the crowd, Marcus felt a sense of gratitude. She had come into his life unexpectedly, challenging his assumptions and leaving him with lessons he hadn't realized he needed. Sometimes, the most extraordinary people do hide in plain sight. And sometimes, the most valuable treasures aren't the ones you find but the ones that find you. Marcus turned back to the market, his steps lighter, his perspective forever changed. The world was full of hidden stories, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to look. And he, like Clara, was ready to find them. Months after Clara's first encounter with the flea market and Officer Marcus Blake, her presence lingered like an indelible mark on the place. Vendors spoke of her with reverence, her name almost synonymous with the market's transformation. "She didn't just teach us about our goods," a vendor remarked one morning. "She taught us to see their stories and ours too." Marcus often found himself strolling through the market on his days off, no longer just the dutiful officer. He now came as a curious observer, a willing participant in the tapestry of life the market wove together every weekend. "Morning, Officer Blake," a vendor called out as Marcus approached a stall brimming with old vinyl records. "Just Marcus today," he replied with a grin, thumbing through the collection. Even in her absence, Clara's influence could be felt. Vendors who once saw their wares as simple trinkets now proudly shared their histories with eager customers. "See this lamp," one vendor said to a young couple. "It's a Tiffany Studios piece from the early 1900s. Miss Clara pointed it out to me months ago. Said it might have lit the rooms of someone important." The couple's eyes widened as they leaned closer, their appreciation growing with each detail. Marcus, listening nearby, couldn't help but smile. Clara had turned a once overlooked marketplace into a hub of knowledge and discovery, a place where every object carried meaning, and every interaction felt purposeful. One weekend, Marcus received a package at the station. The handwriting on the label was elegant yet familiar. He tore it open to reveal a hardcover book titled Unseen Treasures, a curator's journey through hidden history. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dear Marcus, you taught me as much as I taught you. This book is a collection of the stories I've gathered over the years, but it's also a reminder of what we both discovered at that little flea market, the value of looking deeper. Never stop seeking the unseen. Warm regards." Clara. Marcus flipped through the pages, each filled with vivid photographs and anecdotes of Clara's finds, from forgotten fashion masterpieces to mundane objects imbued with unexpected significance. At the end of the book was a chapter titled The Market of Change. It chronicled her time at the flea market, with a special mention of the curious officer who saw her not as a suspect, but as a story waiting to be told. Inspired by Clara's book, Marcus initiated a new community program at the market. He invited experts in various fields, art, antiques, history, to give short talks about recognizing the value of everyday items. "Call it Clara's Corner," he suggested during a meeting with the market organizers. The name stuck. Every Saturday, Clara's Corner drew crowds of vendors, shoppers, and enthusiasts eager to learn. Marcus often found himself speaking, sharing his own experiences and the lessons he'd learned from Clara. "Most people think my job is just catching bad guys," he told a group one day. "But the truth is, it's about understanding people, their motives, their stories. And sometimes, those stories are hidden in the most unexpected places." One crisp autumn morning, as Marcus wandered through the market, he spotted a familiar figure. Clara stood at a stall selling vintage hats, her patched coat replaced with a sleek wool jacket, but her unmistakable poise remained. "Clara," he called out, making his way through the bustling crowd. She turned, her face lighting up with recognition. "Marcus. What a surprise." They exchanged pleasantries, catching up on the months that had passed. Clara beamed as Marcus recounted the success of Clara's Corner and the impact her presence had left on the market. "You've built something incredible here," she said, glancing around at the vibrant scene. "We built it," Marcus corrected. As they walked together, Clara paused at a stall selling old books. She picked up a weathered volume, its spine barely holding together. "See this," she said, holding it out to Marcus. "It's just an old book to most people. But look closer." Marcus inspected the inside cover, where a faded inscription read, "To my dearest Rose, on the day our lives became one. Yours forever, James." "It's not just a book," Clara said softly. "It's a piece of someone's love story." Marcus nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. "You always find the meaning, don't you?" Clara smiled. "It's not about finding meaning. It's about knowing it's always there, waiting to be noticed." When Clara left again, Marcus didn't feel the same sadness he had the first time. This time, he understood that her impact was eternal, woven into the very fabric of the market and its people. The market thrived, not just as a place to buy and sell, but as a gathering of stories, of lives intersecting in meaningful ways. Vendors told tales of their goods with pride, shoppers listened with fascination, and Marcus. He continued to walk those dirt paths, seeing the world with new eyes. Standing at the edge of the market one evening, Marcus watched the stalls pack up for the day, the hum of life slowly quieting. He thought of Clara's words, her lessons, and the way she had opened his mind to the unseen. Sometimes, the real treasures weren't the things you took home. They were the moments, the connections, the understanding that came when you chose to look beyond the surface. The flea market, with all its quirks and characters, had become a living testament to that truth. And for Marcus, every step he took there was a reminder that the world's most extraordinary stories were often hidden in the simplest places, waiting for someone to uncover them.